So as we saw, utilitarianism has some problems. Let's recap quickly what some of the difficulties are with utilitarianism. One is that it kind of asks too much of people. Peter Singer, with effective altruism, which is based on utilitarianism, talks about literally that you should give away one of your kidneys, which is a big deal, and it's actually an invasive medical procedure. So some people say that utilitarianism confuses supererogatory with obligatory action. So it makes you, if you really have to make the most happiness possible for the most people, you're probably going to be obligated to do some things that are most people would consider supererogatory or above and beyond your obligations. There are also a lot of difficulties with implementation. The idea that we could somehow know all the consequences of our actions seems pretty impossible. And the idea that we can weigh the happiness of anybody and anything that might be affected by our actions seems like a pretty tall order. Then there's the idea that it doesn't consider human rights and other possible considerations we might have besides the idea of happiness, if we can even determine what happiness is. So philosophers developed Rule Utilitarianism as a solution to at least some of these problems, and the idea is rather than having to evaluate each action to determine whether it produces the most happiness possible, instead we can apply this principle of utility to making rules that then we can follow. So the idea could be something like, well, generally speaking, ordering the tofu in the restaurant is going to create more happiness overall for everybody than ordering the steak, so therefore that should be your rule. Things like that. They might not be that specific. But that's the idea behind Rule Utilitarianism. It's still going to focus on happiness, but instead of evaluating each action, you can make a rule for your actions that then you can follow to make it a little bit easier. So the example of the restaurant, again, we could ask, should humans eat meat, instead of the individual question of, should I eat meat right now on this particular occasion? So, and then Rule Utilitarians would probably argue against imprisoning an innocent person, which was one of the other examples, since overall, as a rule, society will run better and have more happiness if the justice system only strives to convict guilty people. So, again, we're not really taking human rights into account, but you could argue that the rules might have the effect of respecting human rights, even if that's not the reason for the rule. It seems a little backwards still, perhaps, but this is the argument that is made, is that, look, it's going to work better if we don't consider each individual action, plus it'll be easier to follow. So how is this easier? It insulates the theory against charges that it ignores individual rights, as I said, because normally the rule that produces the most happiness will protect those rights. But there might be cases when it doesn't, and this could be problematic. It also seems to eliminate the need for individuals to spend hours trying to trace down the consequences of any action they might be considering. It also, I didn't write this on the slide, but it also could help with the idea of supererogatory versus moral obligations, because perhaps we could make the rules so that they produce the most happiness, but maybe don't make us do stuff that is not normally expected of people, although maybe that's not going to be a feature of Rule Utilitarianism. It's going to kind of depend on how it's implemented. So the problem really with Rule Utilitarianism as a whole is that it doesn't seem to capture the spirit of utilitarianism. Really the point that Bentham and Mill were trying to make is that they wanted a way to sort of evaluate rules and evaluate laws and really think about things from the perspective of happiness. And to some extent, Rule Utilitarianism can preserve that, but using it to determine rules for everyone to follow seems to defeat the original intent, because the original intent is that there isn't a rule that's going to be right in every situation. That we need to, one of the good features of this that we'll also see later in some other theories, is that instead of making an overall rule, it's more individualistic to each situation, which can be good or can be bad, but the point of utilitarianism was, to some extent, to try to individualize your decisions rather than just blindly following a rule, to actually consider in each instance what is going to be the best choice here. And if you turn it into rule utilitarianism, you kind of lose that, because again, then people are just, presumably somebody's making these rules and then we're just going to sort of blindly follow them, which is exactly what Bentham and Mill did not want. So it seems like you can do this, but then you kind of lose the spirit of the whole operation. On the other hand, a lot of philosophers argue that rules are better, and that's what we'll see next in the next theory that we're going to talk about.